So that was a really wonderful talk by Jim, and I hope there were a lot of artists that were here to see it, because I think it definitely is pointing the way, not just with how we live with ourselves, but what we create and what we put out in the world. And Jim was talking a little bit about these sort of utopian desires and these also kind of anxieties about what we do with science and what we do with technology, and that in a lot of ways is the thesis of Ghost in the Machine. I'm assuming many of you probably have not seen the exhibition, so I'm just going to basically walk you through some of the show and explain a little bit about what we were trying to do with the exhibition. The new museum, for those of you who haven't been there, it's the only museum in New York that's dedicated exclusively to contemporary art, which is what makes it a little bit odd that we're doing an exclusively historical exhibition. This exhibition is really focusing on a generation of artists that were working from the late 50s to the late 1970s. But it really does reach back into the past and reach forward into history to kind of explore how, what man wants from machines, what we believe it can do, and also, what we fear in machines. So some of this work, has been very influential to a younger generation of artists, and some of it has been, was very powerful, and I think, and impressive at the time it was created, and it's a little bit, faded from, let's say, respectability. So I'm just going to walk you through the show and maybe show you some of the highlights and point to some of the figures I think are very important in this discussion about what art and machines have to say to each other. Starting on the fourth floor, one of the things we did with this exhibition is to try to recreate some pieces that were lost to history. And from a curatorial perspective, this is always a challenging thing to do, to look at work that does no longer exist and try to think about how you can kind of bring it back to the public. So one of the pieces that we, is kind of one of the centerpieces of the show, is a piece called the Movie Drome. That's the dome-like structure that you're looking at the center of this picture. This is a piece by an artist named Stan Vanderbeek. Stan started working in the 1950s. He was a filmmaker primarily, but his work kind of extended into other mediums as well. He started off making collage films, and in many ways he was a pop artist, and very much a contemporary of artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Klaus Oldenburg. He was also one of the first artists who was using video as a new medium, and also started working with computer-generated film in the 1960s. And he was an artist who really embraced shifts in technology, both in image creation, but also in communication technology. He did residencies at MIT, and also worked with Bell Labs, which is now, of course, AT&T. The Movie Drome is one of the most legendary pieces that he created, and also it's a piece that very few people actually saw during Stan's lifetime. He, in 1963, came up with the idea for a structure, a dome-like structure, that would be an arena for multi-screen film performances. He was working with 16 millimeter film, Super 8 film, also 35 millimeter slides, and he was really interested in, bringing together almost an archive of the different kinds of image production that have happened, over the course of human history. So what he would do is he would invite his friends over to his home, and he had basically purchased a top of a silo from a silo company in Pennsylvania, and he would ask them to hold these projectors as he would go through a number of his films and basically his collection of images. So it was a very fun evening, and it was very much a part of this sort of 60s kind of psychedelic environment that was kind of burgeoning at the time. But Stan's vision for the Movie Drome was something much more grand. He believed that in a text that he wrote called The Cultural Intercom, that movie dromes could be erected all around the world. Different cultures would have these different structures, and as communication technology changed, they could basically upload images and create sort of a constant stream of images that would be broadcast between all of the movie dromes. So he imagined people coming to their local movie drome and then basically immersing themselves in really a global image culture. And of course, this has obvious parallels to how we deal with images today with the internet, but he was predicting this 30 years beforehand. So Stan died in the early 1980s, but we worked with this family to kind of reconstruct the movie drome, and it's been I think a really wonderful thing for artists to see, especially young artists who are working in the digital realm. Moving on, outside of the movie drome, it's a very different kind of environment. It's a little bit more stark and dramatic. you'll see two sculptures in the foreground. These are sculptures by an artist named Robert Breer. Robert Breer was also an experimental filmmaker working in the 50s, but he also started doing kinetic sculpture very early on. So the two sort of white ghost-like structures you see are pieces which he called floats. These were created in 1970, and they were created for the World Expo in Osaka, Japan. That year, the Pepsi Corporation hired an organization called Experiments in Art and Technology, which was founded by artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Robert Whitman, and engineers, in particular a man named Billy Kluver, who was working for Bell Labs in New Jersey. And between these two sides of artists and engineers, they really were excited about the idea of artists having access to new technology and using this the knowledge of engineers to come up with new kinds of art. So the Experiments in Art and Technology designed a pavilion at the Osaka Expo, and Robert Breer was part of that group. And what he designed were these basically abstract sculptures that would move almost imperceptibly in the pavilion, in the plaza outside of the EAT pavilion. These structures are now moving around on our fourth floor of the museum, and they're very, disorienting and very strange. That part of Breer's impulse came from his interest in Zen Buddhism, but also his father was actually a designer for Chrysler in the 1930s and designed the Chrysler Airflow. So there was, a sense of a desire to create this kind of sculpture that would take advantage of new technology and mobile technology, and basically create a sculptural experience that was a temporal one that you would live with in your home and treat as basically an extension of yourself and almost a part of your family. So we've named these floats, and they're kind of floating around the floor, and they're we definitely have a very close relationship with them. On the walls behind, you'll see a bunch of paintings, which are op art paintings from the 1960s. As I mentioned, we're looking at the 1960s and looking at movements like op art and kinetic sculpture, which were seen at the time to be the most kind of advanced form of kind of abstract artistic creation. We're in particular looking at an exhibition called The Responsive Eye that was shown at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, in 1965, and really introduced op art to an American audience for the first time. Very quickly, the artists who were part of this exhibition, though, were kind of popularized within the fashion community, pop culture at large. You started seeing op art dresses. You see optical patterns in TV and movies, and it stopped being taken seriously as a sort of avant-garde movement, and really became something that was somehow for the public at large. Unfortunately for that generation of artists, it meant they were no longer taken seriously by the critical establishment. So for us, and part of that show, we wanted to bring back some of the real classic works from the first op art exhibitions and show them as really attempts by artists to kind of engage with the sort of mechanics of vision and really create machines for seeing, for altering your perception in a really serious and critical way. So on the wall in the back, you'll see paintings by Bridget Riley and Victor Vasarely, two figures who are really kind of canonical in op art and whose work doesn't necessarily get seen in a museum context very often anymore. This is a piece by a young artist named Seth Price. He's an artist who works a lot with appropriated imagery from the digital realm. This is a piece he made in 2006 where he's basically taken a digitally generated video clip, the kind of sort of visual material that can be used for corporate presentations. It's basically kind of cheap, easily obtainable kind of digital junk. And he's run it through a number of video filters and then transferred it to 16mm film to create a sort of sublime landscape, but one that's completely artificial and completely computer generated. So Seth, in many ways, is an inheritor of Stan van der Beek and the kind of image culture that he was predicting in the 1960s. Moving on, one of the other kind of major historical reconstructions we undertook was a piece by the British artist Richard Hamilton. Richard Hamilton was one of the kind of key figures in the development of pop art and international pop art in the 1950s. He was part of a group called the Independent Group that was operating around the Institute of Contemporary Art in London in the 1950s. And this was a group of artists, architects, designers, writers, and critics who were really engaged with new technology, with popular culture, and with consumer culture, and really were taking it seriously as both as an arena for exploration and discussion, but also as a medium to be explored and to produce new kinds of artwork. So we were interested in an exhibition that Hamilton basically organized in 1955 called Man, Machine, in Motion. And this is an exhibition that was meant to be sort of an immersive archive of images of all of the ways that man has tried to kind of propel himself through the world, starting in the late 19th century and going up to the 1950s. So Hamilton was interested in images and photographs and drawings of different kinds of transportation technologies. So the exhibition is separated into areas of land transportation, sea transportation, air transportation, and there's even a section that hangs from the ceiling of space transportation, where he was looking at sci-fi magazines and that we're trying to predict, how we would explore kind of this new arena in the decades to come. So we worked with Hamilton's widow. Hamilton died last year, to create, to kind of recreate the panels of images, and also this modular display system that he created in 1955, which is I think a really, really wonderful, evocation of that moment and of the way that artists were also moving into fields like architecture and design. There's another image of that. So another one of the sort of, we're not calling this a sort of historical narrative per se, but it's really more of a cabinet of curiosities. There are objects that you don't really expect to see in a museum for contemporary art, and this is one such object. This is a diagram by a German doctor named Fritz Kahn from 1926, and it's called Man as Industrial Palace. And Fritz Kahn was a really wonderful kind of eccentric doctor, and also he felt an educator of the public. And so this is a drawing he did. He did a number of brochures and pamphlets and posters that were meant to kind of try to teach anatomy and teach the general public and the working class how the body worked. So as you can see, he basically equated different systems of the body with different kinds of industrial metaphors. So of course the eye as a camera, and the digestive system as a chemical factory. And it's a wonderful kind of slice of history, but it's also, I think, it was very evocative of how artists would start to think about machines and how machines would replace different functions of the body in the years to come. Another sort of not atypical artwork that we have in the show, we had a number of original drawings by Rube Goldberg, the great San Francisco cartoonist, and these are some original drawings he did in the 1930s, and of course his hero is Professor Lucifer Gorgonzola Butz, and Dr. Butz, his desire was to improve his life through machines, and of course the machines he uses to solve these basic everyday tasks are way more complicated than whatever just doing it by hand. So these are sort of comic images, but these have also been very influential to artists over the years, especially Marcel Duchamp, who was a big fan of Goldberg's, and a number of contemporary artists like Fischli and Weiss, who are also in the show. Moving on quickly, there is a section of the show that's devoted to the automobile and our fascination with cars, and our sort of fetishization of cars and its kind of stand-in for the human body. These are two really wonderful pieces by a German artist, Thomas Byerly, on the left, who creates these sort of tessellated paintings, actually all made by hand by using photocopied images and then kind of cutting them out and pasting them on the canvas. He's created a piece called the Mercedes Madonna in the early 1980s, and it's really looking at this, the icon of German automobile engineering, and elevating it to the level of a kind of religious icon. And on the right is a piece by Claes Oldenburg, of course, the great pop artist, who did a series based on the Chrysler Airflow through his friend Robert Breer, and he did this sort of these sort of plastic multiple, which is he meant to do basically a sort of an anatomical sort of diagnosis of the airflow, and this was actually the only piece he ended up creating of that series. Moving on, there's a section of the show that really is about the collaboration between artists and technology that happened in the late 1960s. And part of the reason we wanted to do the show is, at the New Museum, we do work with a number of young artists who are doing new media work. We often try to pair artists through our sister organization, Rhizome, to work with kind of people working in the tech field to create new kinds of artwork. And this is a reason we wanted to do the show, is because this is really one of the first generations of artists that is kind of open to that collaboration with industry. And there was a moment when organizations like the Experiments in Art and Technology were working with some of the most famous artists in the world to do these kind of collaborations. So we're kind of trying to tell a little bit of that story. So on the left, there are actually drawings that were part of another Experiments in Art and Technology project called Night and Evenings, where engineers from Bell Labs worked with artists in New York to create multimedia performance events. And then on the right, there are a series of films that were computer-generated films that were done with engineers at Bell Labs, in particular a man named Kenneth Knowlton, who was an artist himself, but also a pioneer in computer graphics. So it's a really wonderful there was a really wonderful moment where these kind of collaborations were happening. In the center is another sort of historical oddity that's in the show, but it's a piece we actually borrowed from AT&T and from their archives. It's a replica of the original voder from 1936, and this is, for some of you who don't know, this is an object that was created to synthesize the human voice, and it was used in World War II. But of course, over the years, the voder became the vocoder, and it was used as a kind of tool in electronic music. And it's a wonderful part of of both science history and I think also in what will become cultural history. I'm going to skip over this photograph from Larry Sultan, who's a photographer who basically solicited images from research facilities in the 70s, and show you, this is an image of one installation that was kind of a highlight of the show for us. It brought together a number of sculptures, kinetic sculptures from the early 1960s by an international group of artists. And there were, at that particular moment, artists who were interested in using industrial materials to create an active, physically engaging kind of sculpture that would somehow move outside of the museum and become part of the way you dealt with objects in your home. So there was groups in Germany like Zero, groups in France called like Grave, and they basically met on a yearly basis in Zagreb for exhibitions called the Nouvelle Tendance, or the New Tendencies. So in 1960, this was what artists believe the future of abstract art would be. It was something that was industrial produced, and it was something that would somehow alter your perception of the world on a daily basis. So in the middle, you'll see pieces by Hans Hacke, who is another artist who dabbled in this field in the 60s. On the back wall, there are pieces by Italian artists, Giulio Alviani and Tony Costa. This was a particularly utopian moment where these artists were working collaboratively. They were working as collectives. They wrote manifestos about what they believed their art should be doing in the world, and it was something that was filtering into popular culture. So in addition to the Nouvelle Tendance exhibitions, there was a series of exhibitions called Arte Programmata in Italy that were curated by Umberto Eco, and he was really one of the key theoreticians who were looking at this kind of material. And this is, again, material that hasn't really been brought together in many, many years. One of the pieces that is related to the sort of Nouvelle Tendance is a piece by the artist Johnny Colombo. This is a piece called the Espacio Elastico from 1969. And like a number of artists working at that time, he was interested in discussions about cybernetics and systems theory, and the way that man is part of a kind of an expanding universe that includes technology. So this is actually a very simple mechanical piece where motors are pulling strings, and then black lights are kind of giving you this sort of warped experience of space. But it really was meant to be the kind of cutting edge of sculpture and kind of a really radical experiential environment. These are a number of drawings that were done in Zagreb in the early 1960s using computers and computer graphics programs, and these were shown alongside more traditional works like paintings by Konrad Klapek, where he's painting kind of machines in this sort of eroticized manner. And then on the right, there's a painting by Ulla Wiggin, who was doing these almost anatomical paintings of circuit boards in Sweden in the 1960s. There is one section of the show that I think we're particularly proud of is a group of objects by self-taught artists, artists who are somewhat outside of the mainstream, and were doing artworks that fulfilled a specific, if not healing function, a function that was therapeutic on some level. On the left, there are a number of hanging sculptures by a man named Emery Blagden. He was a farmer from Nebraska who created these sculptures when he and his mother were diagnosed with cancer sort of late in life. So as they were struggling with their illness, he made these kind of wire and steel sculptures that he wired to electricity, and each night he and his mother would sit underneath them, and he called them healing machines. And so they were, there was a desire for this kind of handmade technology to somehow bring him kind of end their suffering on a certain level. And on the right, there are drawings by a woman named Emma Kunz, who was a Swiss mystic and healer living in a cave in Switzerland, and people in the first half of the 20th century would go and visit her, and she would do these drawings using pendulums to kind of concentrate the healing energy that she believed flowed through the universe at this particular spot. And there are accounts of a number of people who visited her and somehow found relief from their ailments through that. We also have a number of drawings of what are called influencing machines, and this is a term that was coined by one of Freud's proteges, Victor Tausk, in the early part of the 20th century, for drawings, particularly by schizophrenic patients, of devices that they believed were kind of controlling their body and their thoughts and their actions in different ways. And of course, what is interesting about these drawings is that, as technology changes and as the kind of machines that we live with and work with change, the kinds of influencing machines that people draw have also changed. This is actually the first influencing machine from 1812, and it's drawn by a man named James Tilly Matthews, who was hospitalized in London, and he believed there was a device called the heirloom that was being used by a gang of French assassins to kind of control his thoughts and kind of create him, cause him to do these kind of terrible acts. So of course in 1812 the loom was one of the heights of technology, and that's what he was using to kind of explain his disconnect between his mind and his body. And this is a drawing by a man named Jakob Mohr, who was hospitalized in Switzerland. This is a drawing from 1916, and he believed that he was there were individuals with these electric boxes that would send these electrical charges to kind of move his arms and his limbs. And it was his vision is a very terrifying, frightening vision, but one that you can see evolving into our own kind of anxieties about whatever technology we're experiencing today. And then, there are a number of contemporary artists in the show, and I'll just end with a couple pieces. The contemporary artists are looking back not just at, an earlier generation of artists, but earlier kinds of technology. So this is a film by a French artist named Philippe Perreno, whose work deals a lot with science fiction, but he was given access to one of the original automatons in a museum in France. And of course, I think for some of you who know about automatons, there was a group of 3 in a particular museum in France. They're little boys who can perform these human-like tasks through a very complicated mechanical interior anatomy. And so one figure can do drawings, one can play the piano, and this one can write messages if you program them to write certain characters. So Philippe was given access to the automaton and allowed him to say, what do you believe, your eyes or my words? And so it's a very kind of haunting vision of what, what technology, what people thought technology would be doing in the 18th century. And this is one last piece by a couple of French artists, Guzmão and Paiva. It's called the eye model. And they're using ostrich eggs and a simple light to kind of explain the way that our eyes create visions. But for us, it's this exhibition was a really a way to look at the sort of sense of wonder that artists continue to have with science, and both today, but also looking back into the past 100 years. So I'm just going to leave it there and then turn it over to JD. So.